This short segment is going to talk about species-specific methods of processing. When we talk about swine, the most common processing method for swine is going to be grinding and or pelleting. Grinding is the most common for mature animals. Pelleting is useful in nursery diets and creep feed diets to improve palatability and reduce any kind of sorting. We do have to pay attention to how fine we grind our feeds for swine, because some level of grinding, fine grinding, can improve feed efficiency, but if you go too far, you can actually increase the risk of ulcers in the pigs. For poultry, grinding and pelleting are also common, but so are crumbles, where it's partially pelletized kind of a thing. And crumbles are larger size pellets, and they can save money because you aren't spending as much money in fully pelletizing it, and are very effective for poultry. There is a risk of high pelleted diets for birds that can actually increase the amount of feather picking and possible cannibalism in commercially produced poultry. And so that's why crumbles or a ground feed tends to be the most common for the poultry industry. For horses, we'd rather crack or roll the feeds through those corrugated rollers. That's preferred over grinding it because of the reduced amount of dust produced in that process. And horses actually will eat more alfalfa if it's cubed or pelleted compared to just baled hay. You get less wastage when feeding cubed or pelleted alfalfa. However, frankly, chopping a forage doesn't really have a clear advantage over baling it, other than potentially reducing wastage. A lot of horse diets are actually pelleted complete diets. They can actually get enough roughage in there to maintain the health and well-being of the horse's GI tract and do it in a pelleted form. This is common, especially with like the geriatric horses and those that need help making sure the feed's easy to chew and they get all their nutrients in it, and a pelleted diet is that. For beef cattle that are fed cereal grains, they're usually processed at some level, whether it's cracked or rolled, or in large feedlots it will be steam flaked. Depends on the grain, but that usually improves intake and feed efficiency. Again, in confinement beef cattle feeding, even the roughages are going to be coarsely chopped to help aid in mixing in the diets and to give it a more consistent blend of ingredients. But when we talk about the grazing animal, there's not near the processing level required because they're out grazing pastures. High-producing dairy cows in confinement type settings, or even in like our organic dairy, does get fed processed grains. We need to be careful of how much processing. Too much processing improves the digestibility of those grains, sometimes too much, that you can actually lower the milk fat percentage, which if a dairy is getting paid on a composition basis, they want higher milk fats. So it's something that you have to watch. Grinding and rolling is fairly common. Steam flaking is also common in dairies where it's a large enough scale that they can afford to justify paying for the steam flaking. Generally, there's no pelleting at all in dairy cow rations. That gets it too fine and is too high a level of processing. In the dairy industry, we do use what is called a TMR, and a TMR stands for Total Mixed Ration. It's an acronym, TMR. And so those TMRs use specialized equipment that are also designed to chop or loosely chop forages and allow to mix these high forage diets. So if you're out and about on the farm and you happen to see be around feeding time for the dairy or the beef unit, you'll see the feed wagons or the feed trucks that are designed to mix these high forage diets. When we consider processing for sheep and goats, it's generally not as cost effective for the mature animals. Actually, some of the lamb feedlots I worked with in Colorado just did whole shell corn. They did not crack it, grind it, or anything, because they did not see enough of a benefit to justify the cost of grinding. In some species, particularly goats that are able to sort feeds extremely well, pelleting will reduce sorting, and that's why sometimes for 4-H and FFA kids that are feeding project goats, I do recommend a pelleted feed, just as it's least likely, to produce risk of sorting for those kids. When we talk about sheep and goat stuff, honestly, if we do process, it's no more than cracking and rolling. Steam flaking and those types of processes are not justified financially for these types of operations. We're going to wrap up with just a little bit of economics regarding processing. And when we consider fuel costs and some different things, grinding happens to be our cheapest method of processing when we consider fuel costs. If you take a look at the table below, you'll notice that grinding here is the cheapest. And that changes as we go up in level of processing, where ultimately if we have to dry anything and try to dehydrate it, we wind up spending a lot of fuel energy. And in today's society, if you're spending fuel, you're spending money. And so it's adding to the cost of your feed, and as a result, may not be cost conducive to be able to do some of these other methods. Wastage can be reduced when we talk about feed wastage by following good processing practices and being very good at bunk management, or making sure the animals are consuming it, watching how they eat it, and understanding what's happening at the animal level. That wraps up the feed processing discussion, and that wraps up also the sections of material for this week.